Hello and welcome to another reading. I really hope you enjoy this one because I absolutely love it. It's Blood Moon, Chapter 1, and the next Sam Rader, Book 6. Just excuse the headset. The microphone on this is a little bit better than what I use normally, so hopefully you'll get a better experience out of this one. Okay, here we go. Chapter 1 of Blood Moon. I hope you enjoy. It wasn't until the smoke had reached high enough to touch the sky that the man looked up from his screen. The explosion had sounded like nothing more than a piece of bubble wrap popping, a muffled snap some 5 miles away. He had positioned the drone at just enough distance from the massacre to ensure he would have a front row seat, but seeing the woman come charging through the cafe door had added an element of satisfaction to the kill. Nelson Tuck knew of Samantha Rader long before she had any inclination that he was hunting her. She had murdered his father, taken the only family he had remaining, and simply gotten on with her life. The questions he faced from authorities after Richard Tuck had vanished from the face of the earth had been difficult to bear, and he thought that they would come and arrest him for the disappearance. The authorities had watched him for several days, and Nelson had taken care to remain as inconspicuous as possible. He couldn't risk them sensing something was wrong, and so had continued to run the farm just as he always had. But he had known the truth, known it from the very beginning. He knew what his father was, a perverted killer who enjoyed torturing helpless women. The Rader woman would have been another one, but she had somehow turned the tables and ended his killing spree instead. Regardless of what she might have seen in the vicious psycho, Nelson looked up to his father and had been helping him try to beat the demons living inside him. He had made some progress and was actively seeking help from medical professionals. When the woman had killed him, she effectively ended any chance for his rehabilitation. During the final week of his life, Richard Tuck had spent countless hours trying to find out everything he could about the new woman on his radar. He'd not only begun to watch her, but to also conduct background checks. It wasn't long before questions arose, questions that seemed to have no earthly answers, and no matter how much he tried, he couldn't seem to find the bottom of the rabbit hole. There were two things he had discovered, with both eventually falling into the hands of Nelson. First, the name Pogrom had come up again and again, but each trail had quickly hit a dead end, while the second had been a live feed into an office. Nelson had watched that live feed endlessly after his father's death, with none the wiser to its existence. The irony of it all was that no one suspected the son to react to his father's murder. It would be a mistake that Nelson promised to turn into unimaginable pain and suffering for the woman, starting with what was most precious to her. What many didn't know was that the son had already taken several significant paces to follow in his father's footsteps, including the murder of 3 people, one of whom had been his own mother. One might say that murder ran in the family, and revenge would be the natural progression. The first time Nelson Tuck had murdered, the death had been ruled as nothing more than a tragic accident. Nobody could have suspected the 15-year-old capable of such a horrendous act, and yet he had planned the murder and executed it with perfect precision. If anybody had paid attention to the Tuck family inner workings, they would have seen a son that worshipped his father. Nelson adored his dad in every way, idolizing the man in a way that could only be described as hero worship. Psychologists may have drawn their own conclusions about the matter, especially seeing that Richard Tuck paid very little attention to his son, often too caught up in his own activities. While still a baby, Helen Tuck would sometimes leave her son in the care of his father, but would often return to find the infant crying in his crib. with Richard tinkering around in the garage. Richard had never taken to fatherhood the way she had hoped, and sometimes feared for his son's safety if she needed to go into work. She had once confided in a friend that she expected to return home one day to find the baby stolen while Richard was working on his pickup. He didn't seem to have a fatherly bone in his body. As the years passed and Nelson grew older, he began to follow his father everywhere, often keen to pitch in and help with whatever his father was working on at the time. To Richard, it felt too much like a chore to watch the kid, and thus mostly ignored him. Nelson didn't mind. Eventually, he watched his parents drift further and further apart. His father spent more hours in the garage, isolating himself from a family that yearned for his attention. Nelson would spend more time alone as his mother took on extra shifts at work. By the time he turned 13, there was very little love in the home, and the family barely spent time together. The only time all three would be in the same room was when dinner was served and each came for their plate of food. Nelson continued to fight for his father's affection and did his best to help out whenever he could. He somehow sensed that the father he wanted was right there and just needed a little help in coming out. Tinkering in the garage became a way of life for the pair. And Nelson worked hard for his father. So when he found out that his mother was having an affair 3 days before his 15th birthday, he devised a plan that would ensure his father's praise. He couldn't allow the woman who had betrayed the both of them to continue living in their home, and thus needed to take action. He waited until the day after his birthday to execute his intentions. It was a simple plan, really, and ensured there would be no witnesses. He selected that day because it was the only day where his mother drove him into town for school. The rest of the time he caught the bus, but on Wednesdays, her work shift began shortly after school started. The day had begun with steady rainfall, only adding to the validity of Nelson's plan. He whistled as he prepared himself for school that morning, kissing his mother on the cheek as he reached for his bowl of oatmeal. He ate alone at the table, watching Helen take care of the breakfast dishes. His father had already left for the day, and when they hopped into the Jeep, he looked at the home one final time, knowing that when he would see it next, it would be just his father and him living there. He didn't plan to just kill her. What Nelson wanted first was an explanation. He wanted to know why she had betrayed the both of them, why she would hurt his father like that. He waited until they were out on Franklin Drive, a long and narrow stretch of road that took them towards the interstate. The question he asked her that morning hung in the air for almost a mile before she answered. Nelson had discovered the name of the man she'd been seeing and simply asked why she would betray her husband by sleeping with her boss. Helen Tuck sat silently as she considered her answer, shocked at having been discovered by her only child. Whatever answer she had intended to give would never see the light of day. As he watched his mother struggle with the notion of being caught out, he waited long enough for her to feel his pain, then silenced her forever. He reached down and pushed her seatbelt button, then grabbed the steering wheel and pulled it towards himself as hard as he could. The Jeep instantly veered right as his mother screamed in shock, caught the edge of the hardtop and flipped. Nelson kept one hand on the wheel and the other gripped tightly to the handle above the door as the world began to somersault around him. He lost his grip after the first revolution, and when the vehicle catapulted off a small embankment, lost consciousness. He woke up 2 days later, a broken arm and a black eye his only injuries. His mother wasn't so lucky, having been flung from her seat and hanging half out of the driver's side window, as the car flipped down the road. Her spine had been snapped in several places, her neck was broken, and half her head had disappeared as the SUV slammed on top of it. The authorities had put the accident down as nothing but a tragedy caused by the slippery road and a worn front tyre. Nobody thought twice about the incident, thankful that the boy had somehow managed to survive such a horrific wreck. Nelson attended his mother's funeral, sitting in the front row next to his father. He had wept when he was supposed to, and kissed his mother's coffin before it had been lowered into the ground. But inside him lay a satisfaction he had never felt before. He had freed himself and his father, and swore to always protect him no matter what. As for Richard, nobody said anything when he didn't sit by his son's bedside as he lay unconscious in a hospital bed. Nobody mentioned the fact that the man didn't appear emotional at the news of his wife's unfortunate death. And when he sat silently by his son at the funeral, nobody spoke about the man who didn't shed a single tear. Not long after her funeral, the Tuck boys packed up their belongings and left the memories of the place far behind them. They eventually landed in the small town of Eagle Grove, Iowa, where they purchased a new house, far from the prying eyes of neighbours and townsfolk. The elder man returned to teaching, a profession he had once sworn never to return to after a misunderstanding. Years later, when the elder Tuck fell onto hard times and came close to losing the family home, it was Nelson that stepped in once again and bought his father out. When his father began to live out horrific fetishes, Nelson protected him, cleaning up whatever he could in order to hide the truth. But when those fetishes had turned into outright murder, the son evolved into what was needed in order to keep his father out of prison. That was until the day Samantha Rader came calling. The drone had kept an eye on the father and daughter when Nelson could no longer follow them. Once he knew where they had gone that morning, he simply returned to the vacant lot out behind the abandoned steelworks and sent his drone up. The bomb had been waiting on Samuel Rader's truck for 3 days, while Nelson waited for his moment to strike. All he needed was patience. He knew she would come home to visit. He knew she would come to visit after he discovered the father's cancer diagnosis. It would simply be a matter of time. The doting daughter called upon by the loyal father. He'd watched her arrival from the top of a nearby peak, watching as she hopped out of a car and embraced the father she no longer deserved. He would take him, just as he would the rest of her family. He would watch each time, promising to witness her grief as she discovered each loss. His revenge would be sweet, drawn out, and as horrific as possible. As he sat in the car and watched the daughter come crashing through the door of the cafe, he smiled, baring his teeth like a beast about to feast on its prey. She tripped and went face-planting down the steps, adding to his pleasure. He thumbed the cell phone number into his own, then watched in glee as the explosion tore her existence apart, ripping the very soul from a man she had worshipped her entire life. Nelson left the drone in the air for as long as possible, taking in every second of her agony. She was screaming, on her knees, and staring at the charred remains of her father. Nelson wished he could have been there, seen the pain firsthand, close enough to smell the old man cooking. But he knew it wouldn't be the final opportunity for that, for he had lots of plans for Samantha Rader, plans that would ultimately tear her world apart. Once the screen began to beep, indicating that the drone had barely enough charge left to return back to its starting point, Nelson hit the button and sent the small device on its way. He waited the 5 or so minutes it took to complete the final part of its mission, then calmly knelt down, picked it up, and shoved it back into the carry case. Just before he climbed into the car, he turned back one final time, took in the column of thick black smoke spewing into the air, and grinned. The first part of his game plan had finally swung into action. Soon, the woman would be virtually surrounded by grief and pain, unable to turn away as it came at her from every direction. He would make sure that nothing of her former life would remain, ensuring that all she considered as family would die before her very eyes. He slammed the door shut, fired up the engine, and turned towards his next target. Chapter 1, Blood Moon. I really hope you enjoy it, and I really hope you check out the rest of the book. Thank you very much.